Let's have a little bit of a talk about education, in particular university education. There's been a lot of discussion lately about online learning tools like MOOCs, massive online courses. I've seen previous fads come and go as well. I remember being involved at a previous university in a project to prepare learning materials on CDs. By the time we finished, the fad had passed. And the latest fad that concerns me somewhat is the inverted classroom. I'm going to call it that. Most people refer to it as the flipped classroom. It's the latest fad. The idea briefly is pretty simple. Don't come to lectures. Listen to your lectures at home, online, recorded. When you come to class, you come to a seminar or a tutorial, you do your homework in class. I've got a number of problems with this mode of education. Firstly, it assumes, the whole fad assumes we haven't been doing this. In certain subjects that I have taught, we've done this sort of thing in the past. We have gotten students to do work in workshops rather than sitting mindlessly in a tutorial. Secondly, why do people get into this flipped classroom rubbish? Because it's another thing to stick on your CV. For the many years that I've been teaching, we have innovated. And you wouldn't think of putting an innovation on your CV. I've seen people put teaching innovations on their CVs. It's part of the job. It's not anything special. It's not anything different. There's an assumption that you do this. The fact that people put these teaching innovations on their CVs suggests or implies that they didn't do them before. They're only doing them because, well, now it's rewarded. Should those people be in academia at all? I don't know. Well, only if their research is good. My fundamental problem with the flipped classroom is this. People who are promoting this fad assume that it is either or. You do it the traditional way or you flip the classroom. Flipping the classroom is better. Well, anybody with a reasonable amount of university teaching experience or teaching experience at any level will know that students learn in different ways. One of the basic philosophies underpinning my teaching has always been triangulation. Provide students with resources, do not assume that they learn the same way, and let every student take what suits their learning style. When I was at UNSW and at Sydney, a lot of students came to class, they attended lectures. I never really worried about what percentage were attending. And when I came to UTS, I noticed a number of differences. One difference was the fact that a substantial portion of students did not come to class. And I guess my response almost immediately was, hey, what am I doing wrong? Or what's wrong with the students? Well, it turns out that the second thing that UTS did at the time that I arrived was partly able to explain this. UTS, when I turned up here 5 years ago, did something called podcasts. Again, a fad word. All a podcast is, they're not real podcasts. They're just lecture recordings that happen to be put online. Okay, they're not proper RSS feeds. They're not podcasts in any sense of the word. But UTS calls them podcasts. And one of the cool things about UTS is we had institutional support for doing this, at least in my faculty. So what it meant was that if you were a student in my class, you had options about how you learned. You could choose to come to the lecture. And for some people, coming to lectures makes sense. There are some people who can sit in a room, focus, pay attention, listen to a tape, listen to a recording, and learn. My experience when I did the CPA program was, well, listening to boring accountants drone on tape for an hour. Oh my God, it was so horrible. I'm not that sort of person. I'm the sort of person that needs to see passion, somebody explaining concepts, waving their hands around, demonstrating. I'm a visual learner. That's why I need that. There are students out there who need that. So some students engage better when they talk to a person or when they listen to a person, when they interact. Some students can't focus very well. And so being forced to come to a lecture or choosing to come to a lecture for 2 hours is good for them. If they had to listen to a recording, they'd do the same thing I do if I try to watch a movie home alone by myself. I keep pausing it and going away and doing other things, procrastinating. So if you're forced to listen to a recording, it might take you 3 or 4 hours to listen to a 2-hour recording. If you're there live in the lecture room, the 2-hour lecture takes 2 hours. There's no pause, there's no procrastination. And hopefully if I am sufficiently dynamic to engage you, it won't be a boring process. So different students take lectures differently. This assumption that we denigrate it, we call it the sage on the stage. This assumption that I have all the knowledge, you don't, and you're there to soak it up. I don't think any lecturer any academic who's worth his salt or her salt behaves that way. This isn't, what was the old saying? Lecturing is knowledge moving from the notes, from the notebook of the lecturer to the notebook of the student without passing through the mind of either. Well, if that's how lectures go, of course, give them up. But those of us who want to engage students, who believe that this matters, we are engaging, and for some students that suits them. Okay, we record our lectures as well. We record short, pithy, learning experience modules. We call them screencasts that take you through particular technical problems. We have tutorials. You come along, we spend a little bit of time going through your homework, but we spend most of the time getting you to work through problems in class. We've always done that. That's the latest flipped classroom fad. Hey guys, we've been doing it for ages. We do it because it works. We've had experience. We know what works and what doesn't. We've tried to get undergraduate students to do presentations. Hey, technical financial accounting subject, they weren't very riveting, so we gave that up pretty quickly. So from experience, we know what works. We know that students learn differently. Some students learn better by listening to recordings at home and coming and interacting with us in class. Some learn better by coming to lectures. I've met students who have done quite well in my subject who have never turned up to a class. Okay? Generally, if you don't turn up to class, unless you're pretty good, it's probably a signal that stuff isn't working. But for some people, that works. So let me get back to my basic point. This flipped classroom. I'm not going to call it flipped classroom. I want to call it inverted classroom. I want to, be sarcastic about it because it sucks. It assumes that there is one choice, that this is the only way you can teach. We know that students learn differently. We know that the psychology of individuals varies. You cannot give the same package to everybody. As an academic who teaches, you need to provide a portfolio of resources for students to use, and students choose the resources that suit their learning style. So some of what I do may not interest some students, but other aspects of the way that I deliver with my colleagues suits those students. Enabling students to choose is student-centered. Student-centered learning is a philosophy. It's not a series of modes of delivery. If you choose a mode of delivery, you're not doing student-centered learning. You're just moving from one method that assumes people learn one way, the same way, to another method, right? That isn't student-centered learning. Student-centered learning is saying, who is our student body? how do they learn? Okay, there's not one answer to that. The question should be, how many different ways do they learn? And then addressing as many of those as possible. Getting the long tail. Making sure that students don't fall through the cracks. That means personal interaction for some. That means recordings and never meeting with us for others. That means coming along to tutorials and practicing for others. Yet again, we also run things we call drop-ins. They're a lot less formal than tutorials. Students use those. It enables the most unstructured questions to be dealt with in a non-threatening way. There are all of these different ways of teaching, and they address the different ways in which students learn. So the inverted classroom, the flipped classroom, it's a joke. It's the latest educational fad, just like management accounting fads. Somebody comes up with a new technique that's really doing the same stuff we did before, but gives it a new name, markets it, earns consulting lucre. Exactly the same thing is happening here. People pushing this flipped classroom rubbish are making their careers on this thing at the cost of student learning. You should not, you cannot, you must not force students to learn the way that you think is best. You must look at what students might want and try to address most of their needs. And guess what? The needs of student A are likely to be different to the needs of student B. So provide a portfolio of learning experiences and let the student choose. That is student learning. That's what universities are about. Not about MOOCs. MOOCs work for some people. We know what the drop-off rates are. We know that these things will work with an engaging academic, but even then only for some students. Universities have two things that differentiate us from other modes of learning. Our reputation and face-to-face contact. Not just with us, the academics, but with other students. That is what a university gives you. If you don't come in and talk to us, talk to each other, engage, work in groups, develop those soft skills as well as the technical skills, then, it might call itself a university, but it isn't. Okay, so you know what I think about the flipped classroom. It's part of a portfolio of learning experiences. But the people out there at the moment, it's just the latest stupid fad. So look at what students need. Don't impose learning on them. Address their needs. Welcome. It seems that my first two substantive rants are both going to be about education. This evening on Lakeland on the ABC, there was a discussion of the quality of education in Tasmania, and in particular it looked at the level of literacy, the frighteningly low level of literacy in Tasmania. And I have heard of people drawing conclusions about Tasmania's viability as a state. Now, let's clarify a few things about the way that this data comes to our attention. Tasmania happens to be a regional area. I hate that word. Happens to be a rural part of Australia. And the only thing that's different between, say, Tasmania and parts of New South Wales are that Tasmania is a distinct state. So we have roughly 500,000 people for whom data is collected because the thing is a state. And we can talk about Tasmania as having a particular situation. We think of Tasmania as a homogenous entity. We don't think of, for example, various parts of New South Wales in a similar way. We always consider them in context, vis-a-vis Sydney, Newcastle, etc. So when we talk about problems with education in Tasmania, it should not be considered so much a problem with Tasmania as a state and its viability, but rather the opportunity to observe a bellwether, if you like, a canary in a coal mine. Essentially what Tasmania is giving us is a view into rural society in Australia in general. and the fact that there are some quite substantial educational problems. And these educational problems, of course, when manifest through ignorance, manifest as ignorance or what have you, end up endangering this country's social cohesion. So maybe I'm trying to defend my home state, but all I'm doing is saying these things need to be taken in context. One of the good things about Australia's state system, because responsibility for things such as education are delegated, although at the moment we are seeing problems with literacy in Tasmania, one of the good things about having state sovereignty in education is that states can experiment. This is something that, for example, Britain doesn't really have, where they have a much more centralised, England and Wales, Scotland's different, where the system is a lot more centralised. So, for example, when I was in matric, years 11 and 12, which people on the mainland would call high school, or even indeed when I was in high school, years 7 to 10, I had the opportunity to study computing, do computer programming, whereas those things weren't even on the radar. Well, they may have been on the radar, but they weren't seriously being implemented on mainland Australia. So what do we have with states running independent policies? Yes, we may have some issues with consistency, with equity, but effectively we have local hothouses that can experiment with things. And if things such as computer studies, for example, go well, which they did, other states adopted them. Having a bunch of states making their own choices allows us to learn from each other. This is one of the good things about Australia's federal system. A bit untargeted there, but I'm not even sure what my message was.